Okay, we are on the Dilbert comic in our Persuasion book. And in this comic, it says, Wally, your political opinions are making your coworkers uncomfortable. That is exactly what people said to Gandhi. You are nothing like Gandhi. Was he a little bald guy who didn't have a real job? And that's the comic right there. So, we're talking about persuasion tip number 14. When you attack a person's belief, the person under attack is more likely to harden his belief than to abandon it, even if your argument is airtight. So the second reason analogies fail is because they are imprecise by definition. That gives people on the other side of a debate all kinds of ammunition, and no one changes their mind when they have that much ammunition for a defense. As it turns out, all of the ammunition provided by bad analogies is in the form of blanks, because analogies are not persuasive and neither are the criticisms of analogies. If you are arguing about the details of an analogy, you are not persuading, and you are not being persuaded. You are just wasting time. But what about comparing Trump to Hitler? Wasn't that persuasive? On social media, and sometimes even in the mainstream media, Clinton's supporters relentlessly compared Trump to Hitler. It was brutally effective persuasion when packaged with related accusations about his temperament and his strongman vibe. Fear is the strongest level of persuasion, and the persuasion filter would say the Hitler-related persuasion made a difference in the election. You might wonder why I say analogies do not persuade, while at the same time I say the comparisons of Trump to Hitler were effective. The answers to that question will take you to a deeper level of understanding about persuasion. My hypothesis, consistent with the persuasion filter, is that people who already had a firm opinion of Trump were not persuaded by the Hitler analogies. That is consistent with analogies being a weak form of persuasion. But not all voters had a firm opinion of Trump. If you are young, you probably didn't experience much of Trump's personal history as it happened. And if you didn't watch The Apprentice, you didn't know him from there either. For the people who didn't already know Trump, the Hitler analogy was effective, not because analogies are persuasive, but because this one did a good job explaining Trump for the first time to people who had no deep knowledge of him. Remember, analogies are great for explaining a new concept, and this concept of Trump as a new Hitler was filling an empty space for lots of voters who didn't know much about Trump. And this brings us to another persuasion topic. I have already mentioned anchors. So the next comic is another Dilbert comic, and it says, I need you to join me on a sales call to tell my customers how easy it will be to switch to our software. It isn't easy. This is a sales call. All you need to do is say everything will be easy. What happens when they find out it isn't easy? They won't find out until after they pay us. What will you do when they complain? I'll tell your boss you misused them. Not if I warn him first. Too late, I already told him. You're a liar. So that's this Dilbert comic here. How to create mental anchors. The first thing you hear about a new topic automatically becomes an anchor in your mind that biases your future opinions. In the comic that we just read, Dilbert's nemesis got to Dilbert's boss first and told him Dilbert was a liar. That would prime the boss's filter to expect Dilbert to lie, with confirmation biases nearly guaranteeing that he would see things that way in the future. But if Dilbert had complained to his boss first, Dilbert would maintain his credibility, and whoever called him a liar later would have a tougher sell in the 3D world of persuasion. Going first makes a big difference. The first whiner wins is kind of how we phrase it in our family. If you see this technique most often from good negotiators. They open with a ridiculously low or ridiculously high offer to bias the other side in that direction. For example, suppose you offered to be my consultant and I have no idea what your services are worth. If the first thing you tell me is that some clients pay you $1,000 per hour I'm more likely to agree to a higher price than if the first number you told me was 100. The initial number becomes a mental anchor that is hard to move. That's why you should always be the first to offer numbers, even if you are talking about an entirely different situation. Yes, that works. See Robert Cialdini's great book, Persuasion. For example, let's say you are trying to sell your business and neither you nor your potential buyer knows what it's worth. A business is only as good as its future, and the future is unknown, so there is a lot of bias and guessing involved when anyone buys a one-of-a-kind business. If you are the seller of the business, you want to prime the buyer by mentioning the high price paid by someone else in an entirely different context. That's enough to anchor a person to the high number, even though it is a different conversation often. Think of Shark Tank if you ever watched that show. For example, if you would be happy to get $5 million for your company, it might help to have a casual conversation before the negotiations about a billionaire who bought a $25 million yacht. Once the $25 million figure gets in your head, in your buyer's head, even though it has nothing to do with the company you're selling, it forms an anchor and it might help you get a higher price. When my startup partners and I were brainstorming how to describe WhenHub.com to investors, we had lots of valid ways to start that description, all biased on fact and totally appropriate and honest. I steered the team toward opening with a comparison of the ways in which WhenHub could be viewed as a new player in the Office suite application space: Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Google Docs, Sheets, and Slides. Those are all multi-billion-dollar products. We think WhenHub belongs in that group, size-wise and function-wise. That opening idea anchors investors to the vastness of the opportunity. Is this sort of framing unethical? It depends on the situation. I wouldn't use this method to negotiate with a family member or a friend, but in a business context, you expect both sides to be using commercial-grade persuasion of this sort. And you don't want to go to a gunfight armed only with a knife. In a business negotiation, each side expects at least some hyperbole and selling technique from the other. Make your own decisions about whether it's ethical to use the same persuasion tools your adversaries are using. In the case of WhenHub, the comparison to Office suite products is entirely appropriate, and we back it up. The sneaker form of persuasion would involve talking about recent unicorn startups in general before making our pitch to benefit from any unconscious mental associations. That would be pure persuasion without helpful information, and you can use your judgment on the ethics of it. I wouldn't use it on a friend, but I would use it in a hostage negotiation. So the human brain forms a bias for the things it hears first. If we accept the thing we hear first, it tends to harden into an irrational belief, and then it's difficult to dislodge. If your friends are reinforcing the idea too, it becomes hard as steel. The persuasion filter predicts that people who already had a favorable opinion of Trump would not be persuaded by analogies, including Hitler analogies, no matter how skillfully applied. But for those who didn't yet have a firm opinion of Trump, the Hitler analogy formed an anchor that was hard to move. The details of the analogy were unimportant. All that mattered was the association, and this leads me to the next point. Associations matter more than reason. The Hitler analogy was effective, not because analogies are logical or persuasive, but because any association of two things is persuasive. If you compare any two things long enough, their qualities start to merge in our irrational minds. The illusion created by analogies is that if two situations have anything in common, perhaps they have lots in common. Trump has a few things in common with Hitler, as do we all, and that makes some of his critics irrationally believe he will also invade Poland. Pulling all of this together, analogies are not persuasive on their own. But if the analogy is simply a carrier for a persuasive association, let's say comparing any strong leader to Hitler, the association can be persuasive to some, even while the details of the analogy are ridiculous. Now watch me summarize this point by using an analogy, because analogies are good at explaining new concepts. If your analogy includes a strong negative association, such as Hitler, you could think of the analogy as a holster and the negative association as a gun. The gun is persuasive, the holster is not. All right, next we'll talk about habit. See you next time. So that's on page 111.